Let's go ahead and start that.
But it's still.
And we're probably going first base. Our team for first base, right?
So, okay, so let's go ahead and get going. So what's our Benedictine value for today?
I honestly don't even know what your
Stability?
Oh, we are on week 13.
That's one more.
Yep, the next to last. You guys will only meet with me one more time.
That's so sad.
Okay, so what's our Benedictine value for today?
stability.
Stability, right? Which was our one for last week, right? This is one of the doubled up values. So what was stability again?
Commitment to one's vocation through everything, throughout life and each day.
Yeah. Yeah, so what's it referencing? Do you guys remember what this is connected to? This particularly, we talked about like monasteries and different types of monks. You guys remember this? So it's like referring to the fact that that in the Benedictine tradition, people stay in one place, right? So they're not moving around constantly changing what they're doing, but they're actually like embedded inside of their communities, right? So there's a benefit to that stability. A spiritual benefit to the people who have it, right? But also a benefit to the people that they interact with, like getting to know a place. That's what we talked about mostly last week. Okay, so what's our habit of mind? I'm going to admit I don't completely see the connection. Because to me it seems like we're looking at opposites. But so what's our habit of mind?
Taking responsible risks.
Taking responsible risks. Okay, so how are we describing taking a responsible risk? There's two things you shouldn't do. Very golden mean, right? Like,
Don't do anything stupid.
so yeah, don't do anything stupid. What do you mean by that?
I just mean like, so stupid could be taken like many different ways here. But I think the thing about taking a responsible risk is knowing the consequences of the risk that you're about to take, whether they be good or bad, and completely understanding how those are going to affect you later in life.
Yeah, so a responsible risk is one where you know or at least know what's likely to happen as an outcome of your risk, right? There's always, you don't necessarily know the outcome, or otherwise it wouldn't be a risk, otherwise it would just be, but like there's a reasonableness to the risk. What else?
This is kind of like the last week's habit of mind with like managing impulsivity. And this is just like, if we could be impulsive, we should make sure it's responsible.
Yeah, there's something in between the two, right? Yeah. So like you could be impulsive, right? Like I think about like Plato talks about like to a brave man, to a brash man, a brave man is a coward, but to a coward, a brave man is brash, right? Like this idea of like in between, right? Being completely impulsive and sort of doing whatever comes to your mind. Like maybe this is a story I should tell. I had an acquaintance when I was living in Knoxville. Actually, he was more of a friend. But he was a now aging punk musician, right? But he was big into anarchy, right? Because most punk musicians are. Which meant that he would just do the most random crap without any forethought. And it was always like, especially like if he had a few too many to drink or something, like you couldn't trust him not to do something really stupid, right? And you think about like that's like risk-taking that's negative, right? Like to some degree, right? Like to some degree what's being suggested here is like you don't want to be completely impulsive, right? But you also don't want to be so afraid to do things that you sort of like, don't take any risks at all, right? And so it's talking about finding that median in between the two. Right? Any other thoughts people have on that part of it? Okay, so then that gets us to our reading, right? So our reading is as always, our practical application of this. And so what did we have for our reading this week? What was our text?
Letter from Birmingham.
Yeah, it was a letter from Birmingham jail. Who was it written by? Yeah, Martin Luther King. Right. Have people read this before this? Or?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is not a first reading of the letter from Birmingham jail. Since it's a very like quotable text, I noticed that. So I was thinking like what we'd do is like do the how we did that like Quaker meeting thing once. I was thinking about like reviving that as a method, and like have you guys look through and like we'll pull out things that you guys noticed, and then we'll reconstruct, I guess, like what's being said from there. First of all, just a little bit of context though before that. What's going on here? What happens in Birmingham? Do people know? Do you remember that from, I don't know, high school history? What happens in Birmingham? What's that?
What?
You said something.
You said what happens in Birmingham, and I said stays in Birmingham.
Stays in.
Just like the opposite of that.
Yeah, well, obviously not, right? I like jokes. It's okay. You don't have to hide them. Humor is powerful. Yeah. So what happens in Birmingham? Do people know?
Wasn't it like there was like a giant riot or something? I could be mixing this up with something else.
I think you're probably mixing it. It wasn't a riot.
I mean, like a big like protest against segregation,
Yeah.
and I can't remember all of what exactly happened, but like MLK gets arrested.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, obviously, yeah, he gets arrested. This is sort of the kickoff of what we normally think of as the civil rights movement, right? The SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, which is headed by Martin Luther King. This is sort of the first big protest where they get nationally televised. Most of the images you see from the civil rights movement, people being attacked by the dogs and shot with fire hoses, most of the imagery, as well as on the Bridge of Birmingham when they rode into them on horseback and beat them, like all that happened in Birmingham initially. So a lot of those images you're thinking about come from the protest in Birmingham and what happened. So does anybody know what the protest that they did was? This is actually a little alluded to in the text, but does anybody know what kind of protest they did? Does anybody know what kind of, yeah?
Did they like boycott the buses, because they have like sort of an act to like boycott the bus system?
That was part, I think that was in Birmingham as well. There was another thing that's alluded to. So yeah, that's one of the things is they boycotted the buses. There's an allusion to something that Martin Luther King was really known for doing.
Marching.
No, it's not the marching. This is an example. So, like, does anybody know what Martin Luther King's sort of form of protest was?
Peaceful protest?
He did this peaceful, nonviolent protesting. Does anybody know what's involved in that?
Where does it sit in?
Yeah, there's like a sit-in at the bars and just peacefully just break all the rules.
Yeah. So essentially, yeah, you peacefully break the law.
Yeah.
And then you sort of accept the consequence.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of reference to that. And you made the reference to the sit-ins, just so we make sure we're all on the same page. What happened at the sit-ins? What are sit-ins?
Okay. segregated bars, they would just like go so that the white only seat, or like in buses, they would sit in the front.
Yeah, you weren't.
Like that.
Yeah. So essentially, like buses were segregated in front and back, right? You weren't allowed to eat at restaurants if you were black, like white restaurants. You had to only eat at certain restaurants that were black only, which weren't very common, right? And actually, like towns, have you ever lived in a town where they have a separate black and white downtown? So a lot of cities in the southern half of the United States used to have quite literally separate white and black downtowns, right? So that like one ran next to the other. What's that?
So isn't that Atchison used to be, because like the Division Street or whatever was like the border of whites and blacks? It's cut off.
Yeah, the neighborhoods. Yeah, the neighborhoods were segregated. I don't think they had a separate downtown area for blacks, though. I don't think there was a black downtown down here. Maybe I'm wrong, and it's just got tore down. Like I used to live in Knoxville, and Knoxville used to have one, but they tore it down in the 1980s to build the World's Fair, which the African American community was really upset about, because they sort of used eminent domain to take away all the black businesses in town, and then tore them down and built a park. But anyways, like so that's so so this city was segregated. A lot of cities were segregated. Schools are segregated here. If you head down Division, you can. Did I say this in this class before?
Probably not.
Okay, just making sure. Yeah, if you head down Division Street, you can see the old black schools. Like they're still there. There's one at the top of the hill here. So has anybody ever gone down Division? So you take second. First. Past St. Benedict's, right, that first road. And then if you go down to the top of that hill on the right is the old elementary school. And then if you go down that hill, on the left is the old high school. So, so those are still, and there's actually a plaque talking about segregation in front of the old high school down there. So, yeah, so a lot of cities were segregated. So essentially what the nonviolent protest did is you broke the segregation laws, right, and then got arrested. So Martin Luther King is sitting in jail, right, basically as a result of having done this. And so last bit of context, does anybody notice who's he writing to?
I'm pretty sure he's writing to a group of ministers who had kind of got together to chat about what Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. And he's basically, because they were like, why are you doing this? We just shut down a segregationalist who was running for office. He didn't get elected, so why are you making a point to do this now? And so he's kind of responding to them.
Yeah, he's responding to white clergy that has sort of sent a chastisement to him. He's like polite about this, right? But essentially they sent a letter chastising him, and he's kind of responding. Okay, so that's the context of what's being talked about. Okay, let's start our Quaker meeting. So we'll start pausing, and as you see things you want to talk about, going back through it, holler them out. You can stand up if you want.
Are you just waiting for a volunteer?
I'm just waiting for somebody to find something.
Oh, just fine. You were waiting for a weekend.
What's that?
I said I didn't know if you were waiting for someone to read it out loud.
Oh, no. I wasn't asking for somebody to read out loud. I was asking basically like, yeah. I was to look back. So it was, remember when we did this before, where you guys look through, and that's what I'm asking. So yes, read aloud when you find something you want to read. talk is a little more intimidating than last time.
Something that I find interesting is, I don't exactly know what paragraph it is, but.
Do you know what page it is? Page
Page
number,
2.
you know? Page 2?
It's the last sentence of the paragraph that starts with "you deplore demonstrations." I think the last sentence is striking to me.
Okay.
It says, "It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative." I feel like that is reminiscent of what's going on today. And what I mean by that is, with all of the riots and all the protests that we've seen this year over the summer and recently, especially with the election, I think it's interesting to see some parallels between the two.
Oh, yeah.
Because you see today all of these people fighting for equal rights, and they're going about it with destruction now, like with the destruction of statues, with destruction of buildings, businesses. I think it's interesting to see that even back then it was like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, you could draw a parallel that like the response that you're seeing is the result of not having, and you can think about all the ways in which African Americans get shut down in the United States still to this day. There's all African Americans aren't, each individual African American doesn't count as the same amount of votes as each individual white person as a result of things like gerrymandering. You guys know what that is? Has anyone ever seen gerrymandering? Okay. Yeah, so gerrymandering is essentially you take a heavily minority district, and most minority districts are gerrymandered, and then, well, I didn't talk about this in here, right? This is, okay. And then they'll essentially draw the district so that it becomes impossible for their votes to count. And so they'll do these sort of, anytime you see a district and it's fissured out, so probably like one of the best ones is, and this is political, it's not racial, this is Austin. Has anyone ever seen a map of the Austin district? This is my bad map of Texas. This should really be over here a little bit more, but just forgive me for being a bad drawer. But like like if this is Austin, right? The Austin voting district looks like this. And it goes all the way to the Mexican border. Right? And then why is that? It's because they're capturing like all these people in between. And you see this, and this is essentially what gerrymandering is, right? So you think about like, there's all these ways in which African Americans are sort of. Did you move it away from
I like kicked it.
What's that?
I like kicked it.
Oh, you kicked it. That's okay. It happens a lot. It's a cheap tripod, so don't feel bad.
It's good.
When we went into quarantine, shelter at home in the spring, I went out and bought the cheapest camcorder and tripod I could find, and then you basically asked them to reimburse me for it because I was like, how am I gonna like record myself talking? But anyways, there's a lot of like, I hated doing the shelter at home. So it was basically me making really boring videos in my office by myself, but. Okay, so yeah, getting back to the point, right? Like, I think you could make a direct parallel, right? That like, in the same way that through voter suppression and a lack of representation, African Americans didn't really have a voice back then, something very similar still happens today. We still have less African American representatives in the United States than we had in the 1870s. Right? So you think about that, right? As a, so immediately after African Americans gained the right to vote, there was actually more representation of African Americans immediately after that than there is today, still. So, point being, yeah, so I think you can like tie that in. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Going off of that, the paragraph that moved me most of the entire letter is on page 15. It says that I wish you had commended the Negro Citizeners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of provocation. I just think that this kind of encompasses the struggle that they were going through, and I just love how he tells it like it is, because I think when you read something like that, you can't look away. Like, you have to be present to their suffering and like have an empathy for them. And I just think, like, especially speaking to ministers who are like in the Christian church, like, that's so encompassing of the gospel message. And that just like really moved me reading that when we were. I think it ties into that discussion.
Wonderful. Yeah, totally. Thank you. I'm going to point out a passage if I can. And then you guys can point out again. Okay, so one I want to point out is, let me see. I got to find it. Okay, so this is on page 7, and I think this is gets us a little bit into like where we see kind of the theme, right, of this calculated risk taking. Is in this, there's sort of like 3 characters in this story, right? If you want to think of them as characters, right? So on the one hand, you have protesters, right? So you have the SCLC and the black protesters. You have another major character, which is it would be like, you know, the Klan and the government, right? And then you have a third major character. So you have white supremacy on one side, you have black protesters on the other, and then you have a third major character. And page 7 is when he first introduces this character, which is the character of the white moderate. And so if you take that last paragraph, right, he's like, I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to honor than to justice. Or sorry, order than to justice. I really think that's an interesting. Who prefers negative peace in the absence of tension to the positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So what's being said there?
Well, to me, what it looks like it's saying is that in the struggle that is for civil rights, and I feel like it's an ongoing struggle, but I think one of the things that this paragraph is stating is that the white moderate are the people who want to make laws just for the sake of making laws instead of actually doing things to promote justice for laws that have already been written. It also seems to me that like while the white supremacists, and I put that in air quotes because I mean, yes, I think it's so prevalent, but I don't think it's like, people see only the 2 sides, white supremacy and oppression, rather than the whole of it, which is everyone is choosing a side, whether they, you know, are consciously aware of it or not. Subconsciously, they choose a side, and I think that those who say that they aren't choosing sides are saying that just to create more confusion for the whole situation.
Also, I feel like he's saying that, like, a lot of times in terms like or like in situations like this, like you're like, oh, like the problem is the other extreme, but he's almost saying that like the moderate is, because he has that line where he's like, the stumbling block is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, because like it's not just like that they believe in these things, it's just like they are so like passive that they can't be swayed either way because they just want to keep the peace. And so it's like it's like worse to be that like in between. It's like pick a side, like don't be a fence sitter, you know, or it's like, or then like a lot of times they're like, well, I'm not like racist, like I'm not doing these things, but like since they're not like helping, and like not even necessarily like a call to like go out and like do this, like, you know, like be like super active, but like they're like sitting back and being like, let's just keep the peace, is like making it even harder for people who are like working for civil rights.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually like, in a lot of ways, like if you think about it, like Martin Luther King's whole protest movement is about gaining attention of those white moderates, waking them up, right? So like it's quite literally like by breaking these laws, which are kind of crazy laws, and they're also like not super like difficult laws to avoid breaking, and they're not, right, super violent laws to break, right? And what's the response to that? Running somebody over on horseback. Like that's a pretty harsh response to showing up at a restaurant, right? Like, so you think about essentially what it's trying to do is it's trying to show the sheer level of violence of that response. Two, and it's also that it shows up on television so that people actually see it, right? Like, yeah.
One more thing that I found in this paragraph is the quote right after that says, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with you in your methods of direct action." I think that people today need to understand that, yes, the goals that you have for the movements, for the protests are good goals to seek. However, the methods in which some people try to achieve that goal are so far out of line, and you see it all the time, like, people destroying statues, like I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
people destroying businesses, people like trying to gain that attention. I think they are trying to do that just to gain the attention. I don't think it's because they are trying to push the movement along a track. I think it's just to say, oh, hey, we support this, but we're not doing anything to progress the movement. I think that's something that a lot of people are missing, is that the actions that you take need to either progress the movement or take a step back and say, hey, what we're doing isn't working. How can we fix this so our goals can be met?
I think you got that quote backwards, though.
Did I?
Because he's the one committing direct action. So Martin Luther King is the one committing direct action. The chastisement is coming from the people who he's writing the letter to. So that's like a quote. So like they're telling him not to act directly, not to go out and break the law. That it's untimely, that he shouldn't do it, right? That it also like, and so there's actually like a big theological point embedded in here. I'm not sure if you guys caught that. You had something to say. I'm going to let you talk for a second.
Well, this kind of goes off of what you're saying with the theological thing. In Revelation, there's a line where God's like talking to like man or whatever, and he says, since you're lukewarm, I spit you out of my mouth. And he's like essentially saying like it's better to be either hot or cold, because or like the opposite of like love isn't, or like hate like can be directed into love, because it's like you still feel something, you still have passion, but like that like moderate, like lukewarm, like kind of is like just the worst thing that you can be. But yeah, so like they're like telling him like I agree with the cause, but you shouldn't be like doing these things. But he's like, no, if you agree with the cause, we have to do something. Like you can't say like, oh, like saying that you agree with something but not actually acting on it doesn't mean anything at all. Like that's just empty words.
Yeah. So that's, definitely like, and I think that right there you're getting right to the theme of why I think this was assigned for our habit of mind, right? Is because like the idea is that you could be like the white moderates and do absolutely nothing, but like in some ways like you're not taking any risks out of fear and pacificity then, right? So like what's driving you is actually your own fear and lack of trust, right? Rather than it being like some like but you also on the other end, like Martin Luther King is not the most radical civil rights leader that's out there, right? You have black nationalism, or he makes a reference to the black nationalists, right? So you have people who are planning military engagements against the United States at this time, separatist groups, right? And that goes back even before like Garveyism. Marcus Garvey was another protester earlier in the 20th century who had far more, in some ways, far more extreme tactics, right? And so you could almost say that like that's almost an uncalculated risk, and those things often did result in things. Not to like, there's a lot of positives about like the Black Panther movement and the Black nationalist movement. So don't think this is me actually like completely squashing that stuff down either. But yeah, so basically which we have today too, right? So thinking about the movements, right? We have like Black Lives Matter, which is actually a very similar movement to like SCLC, right? It's not a very radical movement, like in terms of like the history of movements in the United States, right? And then you have more extreme factions that are smaller, that actually like promote more extreme things, like the anti-fascist movements, you know, that are actually like often taking sometimes direct violent action, right? And the same thing was happening back then in the 60s. And so like you think about like in terms of extremes, doing nothing, staying moderate, like avoiding action is on one hand, right? And then the other is sort of extreme action, right? Revolutionary action. And, you know, instead we have this sort of calculated risk, you know. And in some ways, like, you know, you think about like Martin Luther King died for taking calculated, careful risks. Like, you know, somebody was afraid enough of his movement to shoot him, right? Like, as were a lot of the SCLC people. So they were taking a calculated risk knowing that that might happen, right? But they weren't taking these sort of more extreme actions, right? So definitely kind of in between those two. I think that's kind of one of the points that's being brought out here. Make sense? Cool. Go back into Quaker mode. Tell me if you find something else you want.
Something else that I noticed at the bottom of page 10. Oh, the first two lines. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate or for love? I think, again, tying into current events, because it seems like there are so many parallels between the 1960s and now, is what kind of extremism do you want people to see? What kind of projection do you want others to see who could potentially follow the movement that you have? I think, again, just kind of going back to what I've already said earlier, is that I do think there are people who are trying to fight for, like, be extremists for love, and the fact that they want the equality, they want to have, you know, equal rights. But I think there are also those extremists for hate who are doing all this destruction just as like a show of, like, you know, we are capable of all this violence, but to what end? Is the question that I would have to know. Is to what end do you see all this violence? What end is it that you are trying to meet with the violence, the hate?
So the hate thing's interesting in here, right? So like, does Martin Luther King seem to understand why some African Americans are moved by hate in their movement? Yeah, he does. He's actually very sensitive to this fact, right? So like one of the things he wants to point out to white clergy, right, is sort of like That's kind of a natural response to being oppressed, is to get, to some degree, to harden oneself, right? And so like there's something actually like really interesting about how he wants to create a very different sort of movement, right, than that. And so but the antagonism is easy to understand, right? Because like in reality, like oppression is really harsh. It still is today, right? So like you know, we still today, like, you know, African Americans are more, a young African American man is significantly more likely to wind up in prison than he is to go to college, right? And most of the time, people go to prison for things that. Does anybody know what most people are in prison for, by the way? This is just sort of an aside, but what the most common? Yeah, so most common is drug crimes. Does anybody know what drug crime is most common?
Possession?
Simple possession. So does anybody know, like, well, I'll just say this, right? So there's possession and there's possession with intent to sell. Okay, so if you were to go to a state where it's, so I only know this because I was living in Michigan before this. Michigan is a state where it's legal to own marijuana, right? Yeah.
Isn't Detroit the heroin capital of the U.S.?
Yep.
Yeah, it is.
Fun fact.
Yeah, actually, sorry, the drug culture in Michigan, it's far more common to see heroin and cocaine than it is meth because it's like so cheap and available in Michigan.
I think St. Louis is the meth capital of the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
I just moved from one extreme to another. But anyways, so usually the smallest increment of marijuana you can buy legally at a time is something called a quarter, which is a quarter of a pound, right? Which is a lot. It's a lot of marijuana. So anyways, simple possession starts at anything more than an eighth. So simple possession ends at anything more than an eighth. So the point is this. In states where it's legal, you can't even buy the increment of marijuana that would allow you to be arrested under simple possession. Simple possession basically means that you only have enough for the next day or two for personal use, right? Most of our prison population has gone to prison just for that, right? And most of them are African Americans. Now, if you actually start looking at who uses marijuana, studies on who uses marijuana, white people are just as likely to use marijuana as black people, but they're not likely to be arrested for it, right? And then on top of that, like if you do get arrested, you're more likely to be convicted. The length of the conviction goes up if you're black. So it's two people committing the same crime, right? So the point is this. African Americans today have all kinds of issues that they face as a result of how the criminal justice system treats them. And one natural response to that, and I would say for Martin Luther King, you would call this a natural response, is for people to feel a certain sense of hardened anger towards white people, right? And so what he's kind of getting at with this movement of love versus movement of hate is you have, on the one end, sort of white hate towards African Americans, which actually in a lot of ways predominates our system and how we treat African Americans. It's where our fear of African Americans predominates the policies that we have towards them, right? So on the one end you have that. On the other end you have the somewhat natural response of hate. The very hard road to take is this sort of thing in between, right? That's being promoted there. That makes sense. So I think that's kind of what's being referenced. Okay, one last passage. I'm just going to steal the class. The one last passage that I want us to look at, and this is just because I made a reference to a theological point being made in here. Did anybody catch this thing about just laws and unjust laws on page 5?
Yeah.
So, and this is also being referenced in that law and order comment, right? So one of the attacks, so actually a lot of white Protestant churches came out publicly against the civil rights movement, and a lot of actually white Protestant churches still are against the civil rights movement, even the historic civil rights movement in the 1960s. including some of the church bodies I've belonged to, through my year, when I was, through the years. But anyways, and often the comment that you'll hear being made is like, well, you have to follow the law, right? So like, like anytime you break the law, like essentially that is a sacrilegious thing to do. And so he's responding to that in a certain way. I think this is an interesting comment. I'm not teaching theology, so don't take this as a prescriptive, this is what you should believe. I just think it's an interesting comment. So what's the idea here about just and unjust laws? It takes up like a good chunk of this letter.
I guess like the overall like theme or whatever is that like the only law, like we're called to obedience to just laws, like you're morally and legally bound to follow them.
Yeah.
But if they're unjust, then like you're not supposed to follow them. And like that was actually, I thought that was like important because like a lot of people will come for like any Christians, but I mean like especially Catholics, where they're like you're just blindly following, like you're like sheep, like that kind of stuff. But the thing is, like, it's important to, like, understand that because that's how you prevent, like, that blind obedience.
Yeah.
And it's, like, it doesn't matter, like, or then, like, with the recent, like, scandal with, like, the Pope, like, supporting gay marriage, and it's, like, whether or not he actually did support it, like, that doesn't necessarily matter so much as it's, like, ultimately that doesn't affect the individual Catholic because, like, they have to understand, like, church teaching or, like, Christ teaching on their own.
Yeah.
And be able to call, like, should I follow what he said or should I not? Like, is it just or is it unjust?
Yeah. Anything else about the just and unjust law? And that actually hits on something like at some point, if any of you want, like, because I'm not Catholic, so I'm very like fascinated by the statement, and I haven't been bold enough to ask Catholics yet, like, how are you taking that? Because like, I know people who are Catholic who would very much so be opposed to that, and I know people who are Catholics who were probably pretty happy about what the Pope had said. So, I'm curious. So that's an open invitation if anybody wants to dialogue about that and explain it to me, that'd be great.
I think, like, Adeline, didn't we kind of look into that? Like, because I think, like, what, like, the ultimate conclusion was is that, like, he was, like, misquoted in that, like, he was, because Pope Francis is, like, very known for, like, love, where it's, like, the love of the sinner and, like hated the sin or whatever, or, like, specifically, like, loving sinners. And so, like, that's at least one side that I heard, that it was, like, he didn't necessarily intentionally mean to, like, be like, yes, like, gay marriage is okay, like, let's go for it, but so much as that, like, people who choose to, like, partake in gay marriage or, like, all that kind of stuff, or, like, if they support it, like, you are not called to hate them. Like, we're called to love them.
Still deserve God's love.
And that they should still be allowed to be a part of the church was the comment, right?
Yeah. Or then, like, also, like, if they legally are allowed to do it, like, it was just, like, it's, like, more to me, where he's, like, just calling for people to be tolerant, I guess, is the best word. I don't know. Maybe not the best word.
Yeah.
And he's saying, like, don't ostracize them.
Yeah.
But as far as legality goes, I watched there's like